In the race to become a global superpower, nations often look to their rivals not with hostility, but with admiration and, imitation. India, now the world's most populous country after overtaking China in 2023, has long studied its northern neighbor's development blueprint with intense fascination. From manufacturing hubs to infrastructure megaprojects, India has sought to replicate China's economic miracle on its own soil. But there's one particular Chinese achievement that has captivated and honestly haunted Indian policymakers for over 4 decades: the South to North Water Diversion Project. It's a feat of engineering so ambitious that it redirects entire river systems across thousands of kilometers, quenching the thirst of hundreds of millions of people in China's arid north. India looked at this marvel and thought, we can do that too. The result? A $170 billion plan that's been stuck in bureaucratic limbo for 44 years. A vision so grand it could transform the subcontinent, yet so complex it remains frozen between political speeches and PowerPoint presentations. Today, after more than 4 decades, only a single branch line has been completed. And even that sits idle, unopened, unused, a monument to unfulfilled promise. This is the story of India's National River Linking Project, a dream that refuses to die but somehow can't quite come alive. It's a tale that reveals not just the technical challenges of moving water across a subcontinent, but the deeper obstacles that can stop even the most well-intentioned plans in their tracks. Money, politics, diplomacy, and the fundamental question of who gets to drink when water runs dry. China's hydraulic masterpiece, the project that changed everything. To understand India's struggle, we first need to grasp the sheer magnitude of what China accomplished. China is a nation of geographical extremes. The southern regions, lush, humid, crisscrossed by rivers, hold over 80% of the country's freshwater resources. Meanwhile, the north, home to major cities like Beijing and Tianjin, along with vast agricultural regions, suffers from chronic water scarcity. The northern plains are dry, dusty, and increasingly desperate for water as industrialization and urbanization accelerate. For decades, this imbalance threatened China's development. How could the north grow if it couldn't even guarantee water for basic needs? The answer came in the form of one of humanity's most audacious infrastructure projects, the South to North Water Diversion Project. First conceived in the 1950s and formally launched in 2002, this network of canals, tunnels, and reservoirs was designed to channel water from the water-rich Yangtze River basin northward to the parched regions along the Yellow River and beyond. The scale is honestly difficult to comprehend. The project consists of 3 massive routes: eastern, central, and western, spanning a combined distance of over 4,350 kilometers. That's roughly the distance from New York to Los Angeles. The eastern route alone stretches approximately 1,200 kilometers from Yangzhou through Shandong and Hebei provinces, ultimately reaching Tianjin. It's designed to transfer 14.8 billion cubic meters of water annually. The central route is even more dramatic. Starting at the Danjiangkou Reservoir in Hubei Province, water flows northward for about 1,500 kilometers through open canals and tunnels, crossing 4 provinces before reaching Beijing and Tianjin. This route alone moves 13 billion cubic meters of water each year, enough to fill roughly 5.2 million Olympic-sized swimming pools. Then there's the western route, still largely in the planning stages, which aims to divert 14 billion cubic meters annually across 1,751 kilometers of some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, including the Tibetan Plateau. The entire project required an investment estimated at approximately 500 billion yuan, around $79 billion at the time of construction, though some estimates suggest the real cost exceeded $100 billion when adjusted for all associated infrastructure and resettlement programs. over 330,000 people were relocated to make way for reservoirs and canals. And here's the remarkable part. It worked. The first phase of the eastern and central routes became operational in 2014, just 12 years after breaking ground. Since then, these routes have transferred over 70 billion cubic meters of water to northern China, directly benefiting more than 176 million people across 7 provinces and municipalities. The project has also replenished rivers and aquifers along its path, adding 8.5 billion cubic meters to northern waterways and helping to reduce groundwater over extraction by more than 5 billion cubic meters. Farmland that once cracked under the sun now blooms green. Rivers that had run dry for years flow again. Cities that rationed water now have stable supplies. Beijing, once so water-stressed that officials considered relocating the capital, now receives over 70% of its drinking water from the project. This is the model India looked at with envious eyes. India's water crisis. A mirror image with a twist. India faces a water distribution crisis that's eerily similar to China's, but flipped like a reflection in a mirror. While China has abundant water in the south and scarcity in the north, India's situation is reversed. The northern Indo-Gangetic plains are blessed with water, while the southern Deccan Plateau struggles with chronic shortages. Let's examine the north first. The Gangetic Plains, stretching across states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and West Bengal, receive concentrated rainfall thanks to the Himalayan mountain range, which acts as a natural barrier trapping monsoon moisture. Annual precipitation here regularly exceeds 1,000 millimeters, with some regions recording over 2,000 millimeters, comparable to some of the wettest places on Earth. This region is also home to over 30 major river systems, including 2 of the subcontinent's most sacred and vital waterways, the Ganges and the Yamuna. The Ganges alone carries an annual flow of approximately 507 billion cubic meters, while the Yamuna contributes another 550 billion cubic meters. Together, these 2 rivers account for nearly 60% of India's total surface water runoff. They are, quite literally, India's lifelines. Now contrast that with southern India. The Deccan Plateau, elevated but not high enough to capture significant moisture, receives far less rainfall, typically between 500 and 800 millimeters annually. Worse still, its proximity to the equator means high rates of evaporation, which further strains already limited water supplies. During summer months, temperatures can soar above 40 degrees Celsius, and water sources shrink dramatically. The result is a growing crisis. Southern states like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh face recurring droughts, agricultural failures, and intense competition for water between cities and rural areas. In Chennai, one of India's largest cities, residents have experienced day-zero scenarios where taps run completely dry. Water tankers become the only source of supply, and the poor suffer most. This geographic irony, abundance in one region, scarcity in another, seem to present an obvious solution: move the water from where it's plentiful to where it's needed. And thus, India's National River Linking Project was born. The grand vision connecting a subcontinent. The idea of linking India's rivers isn't new. British colonial engineers discussed it. Independent India's first leaders contemplated it. But it wasn't until 1980 that the government formally proposed the Interlinking of Rivers project, known in India as the ILR. The vision was, honestly, breathtaking in its ambition: construct 13,000 kilometers of canals, hundreds of reservoirs, and approximately 30 major dams to create a nationwide water grid. This network would connect more than 60 rivers across the subcontinent, forming a hydraulic web that could redistribute water according to need rather than geography. The project was divided into 2 major components. The Himalayan component would involve 14 river link projects in the northern mountainous regions, capturing excess monsoon flows, and glacial melt from rivers descending from the Himalayas. The peninsular component would consist of 16 river links across southern and central India, connecting rivers like the Mahanadi, Godavari, Krishna, and Kaveri to create an integrated water system across the peninsula. The plan was to implement this in 3 phases over several decades. Once completed, water from the perennially flowing northern rivers would be channeled south and west, reaching the water-stressed regions of Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Tamil Nadu. On paper, the benefits were staggering. 35 million hectares of additional land could be brought under irrigation, 34,000 megawatts of hydroelectric power could be generated, flood damage in the north could be mitigated, and the chronic droughts of the south could be ended. It seemed like a win-win-win situation. So what went wrong? The first obstacle: money talks, and India can't afford the conversation. Infrastructure projects live or die on their budgets, and the National River Linking Project has a budget problem that borders on existential. When the plan was first seriously revived in 2001, following a devastating drought that left millions without adequate water, initial estimates put the cost at approximately $110 billion. That figure alone was staggering. To put it in perspective, India's entire fiscal revenue that year was less than $50 billion. The country's GDP stood at just $485 billion. In other words, the project would cost more than double the government's annual revenue and nearly a quarter of the entire national economy. It was a non-starter. Fast forward to 2022, and the situation has only become more challenging. Updated estimates now peg the total cost at around $170 billion, or even higher when accounting for inflation, land acquisition, environmental mitigation, and the inevitable cost overruns that plague large infrastructure projects worldwide. To understand how enormous this is, consider that $170 billion represented approximately 44% of India's GDP in 2022. For comparison, China's south-to-north water diversion, already considered one of the most expensive infrastructure projects in history, cost roughly 15 to 20% of China's GDP at the time of its construction. India's project is proportionally more than twice as expensive. Where would this money come from? India's infrastructure budget is already stretched thin across competing priorities: roads, railways, power plants, digital connectivity, healthcare, education. The government runs persistent fiscal deficits. Foreign investment in such politically sensitive projects is limited. And unlike China, which has state-controlled banks that can be directed to fund national priorities, India operates in a more market-driven financial system where such massive long-term investments face rigorous scrutiny. Even if the money could somehow be raised, there's another problem: opportunity cost. That $170 billion could alternatively fund thousands of smaller, localized water management projects, rainwater harvesting systems, drip irrigation networks, groundwater recharge programs, wastewater treatment facilities that might deliver faster, more distributed benefits. But money, as it turns out, is only the beginning of India's problems with this project. The politics of water. When states fight states, India is not China. This simple truth explains more about the project's failure than perhaps any other factor. China operates under a centralized single-party system where the national government can make sweeping decisions and implement them with relatively limited resistance from provincial authorities. When Beijing decided to build the south-to-north water diversion, provincial governments fell in line. Dissenters were overruled. Relocated populations were compensated and moved. The project proceeded. India, by contrast, is a federal democracy where states wield enormous power. Each of India's 28 states has its own elected government, often controlled by different political parties with competing interests. The national government in New Delhi can propose, but it cannot simply impose. And when it comes to water, arguably the most politically charged resource in a drought-prone country, states guard their interests jealously. Consider the perspective of northern states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh. Yes, they have relatively abundant water, but they also have more than half of India's 1.4 billion people. They have their own growing cities, expanding industries, and vast agricultural sectors that depend on reliable water supplies. State leaders ask a reasonable question. Why should we send our water south when we'll need it ourselves in the coming decades as our populations grow and our economies develop? This isn't hypothetical. The Uttar Pradesh government has repeatedly expressed concerns about any plan that would divert significant quantities of water from the Ganges or Yamuna. Political leaders in the state have called such proposals a threat to northern development. During election seasons, politicians compete to show who can be the fiercest defender of local water rights. Meanwhile, southern states, the supposed beneficiaries, aren't entirely united either. Tamil Nadu and Karnataka have been locked in bitter disputes over the sharing of Kaveri River water for decades. These disputes have triggered riots, forced Supreme Court interventions, and even strained national unity. If two neighboring states can't agree on sharing water from a single river, how can 29 states agree on a nationwide system? Then there's the question of control and pricing. Who decides how much water flows where? Who pays for it? If water is transferred from Uttar Pradesh to Tamil Nadu, does Tamil Nadu pay Uttar Pradesh? If so, how much? And who manages the infrastructure in between? These aren't merely technical questions. They're deeply political ones that cut to the heart of Indian federalism. In a country where water riots have killed hundreds of people, where farmers have committed suicide during droughts, and where access to water can determine election outcomes, no politician wants to be seen as giving away their state's most precious resource. And this brings us to an even more complex dimension: international politics. The diplomatic minefield. When rivers cross borders. Rivers don't respect political boundaries, and many of South Asia's major waterways flow through multiple countries. This transforms what might seem like an internal Indian infrastructure project into an international diplomatic crisis in waiting. Bangladesh presents the most dramatic example. The Brahmaputra river system, one of the world's largest, originates in Tibet, flows through northeastern India, and eventually enters Bangladesh, where it's known as the Jamuna, before joining the Ganges and emptying into the Bay of Bengal. Any major dam or diversion project on these rivers in India directly affects water availability downstream in Bangladesh. In 2009, India proposed constructing a dam on the Barak River, also called the Surma Meghna in its lower reaches, as part of the larger river linking scheme. The engineering logic was sound: capture excess monsoon water, store it, and redirect it to water. Scarce regions. Bangladesh saw it differently. From Dhaka's perspective, this was an existential threat. Bangladesh is one of the world's most densely populated countries, with over 170 million people crowded into an area roughly the size of Iowa. It's also one of the most climate-vulnerable nations, with large portions of its territory lying barely above sea level. Agriculture employs nearly half the workforce, and farming depends entirely on the predictable flow of rivers. If India built dams upstream and diverted water, Bangladesh's agricultural productivity could collapse. Fish stocks would decline. Saltwater intrusion from the Bay of Bengal would penetrate further inland as freshwater flows decreased. The ecological balance of the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, would be jeopardized. The Bangladeshi response was swift and fierce. Opposition parties accused the ruling government of being too weak in dealing with India. Protests erupted in Dhaka. Diplomatic tensions escalated. Bangladeshi officials warned that water security was a matter of national survival and that they would not accept any project that threatened their rivers. India found itself in a bind. Bangladesh is an important neighbor, culturally connected, economically intertwined, and strategically significant. Indian companies export billions of dollars worth of goods to Bangladesh annually. The two countries cooperate on security issues, particularly in countering insurgencies along their shared border. Was it worth jeopardizing this relationship over a single dam? The answer ultimately was no. The project was quietly shelved. But Bangladesh isn't the only country involved. Pakistan, with which India has fought multiple wars, shares the Indus River system. Nepal, source of many Himalayan tributaries, is sensitive about downstream water use. Even Bhutan, generally friendly with India, has concerns about projects that might affect its own water security. Any comprehensive river-linking project would require negotiating water-sharing treaties with multiple neighbors, some friendly, some hostile, all protective of their interests. This diplomatic complexity adds another layer of near impossibility to an already daunting challenge. When Narendra Modi and the Bharatiya Janata Party swept to power in 2014, many observers thought the river-linking project might finally gain traction. Modi had campaigned on a platform of decisive governance and infrastructure development. He promised to cut through bureaucratic red tape and make bold decisions that previous governments had avoided. The river-linking project seemed tailor-made for Modi's image as a man who gets things done. And, initially, there was movement. The government appointed committees, allocated preliminary funds, and issued directives to expedite planning. Modi spoke about the project in his Independence Day addresses, framing it as essential to India's future food security and economic growth. By 2019, after years of slow construction, the first phase of a pilot project, the Ken-Betwa link, was completed. This project connects two rivers in central India, involving the construction of a dam and a canal system to transfer water from the Ken River in Madhya Pradesh to the Betwa River in Uttar Pradesh. It was meant to be the proof of concept, demonstrating that India could indeed execute this vision. Engineers had overcome technical challenges. The infrastructure was built. All that remained was to open the gates and let the water flow. And then the farmers arrived. Large infrastructure projects in democracies always involve trade-offs. Someone gains, someone loses. In China's water diversion project, over 330,000 people were relocated. They were compensated, given new homes, and the project proceeded. In India, things don't work quite the same way. As the Ken-Betwa link neared completion, farmers in the affected regions began to realize what the project would mean for them in practice. Land would be submerged beneath reservoirs. Agricultural patterns would change. Some farmers would lose their traditional water sources even as water was meant to flow to others elsewhere. And crucially, many didn't trust the compensation or resettlement packages they were offered. What followed was one of the largest farmer protest movements in recent Indian history. Tens of thousands of farmers took to the streets, blocking roads and staging sit-ins. The protests stretched on for months. Images of police clashing with farmers became regular fixtures in the news. Political opposition parties sided with the protesters, smelling an opportunity to embarrass the Modi government. The farmers' demands were clear: better compensation, guarantees about water rights, and fundamentally, a voice in decisions affecting their livelihoods. But underlying their specific demands was a deeper distrust, a sense that big infrastructure projects benefit urban areas, industrialists, and political elites while leaving rural communities to bear the costs. Faced with sustained protests and growing political risk, the government backed down. The Ken-Betwa link project, though physically complete, was not put into full operation. Water didn't flow. The canals remained largely empty. The project sat in limbo, a monument to what could have been. This outcome sent a chilling message to anyone hoping to advance the larger river-linking vision. Even when you succeed in building the infrastructure, you might still fail to use it. The story of India's river-linking project reveals a fundamental truth about development. You can't build 21st century infrastructure on top of incomplete governance systems and expect it to work. China's success with the south to north water diversion wasn't just about engineering prowess or financial capacity. It was also about having a governance structure capable of making hard decisions, overriding local opposition when necessary, and implementing plans at scale. India lacks this capacity by design. Indian democracy prioritizes consensus, debate, and the protection of minority rights. Power is dispersed among levels of government. Citizens have multiple avenues to challenge decisions, through courts, through protests, through the ballot box. This has many virtues, but decisive, rapid infrastructure development isn't one of them. This doesn't mean India can never build large projects. The Delhi Metro, for instance, was successfully completed. The country has constructed numerous dams, highways, and power plants. But projects that work within individual states or clear jurisdictions are different from projects that require sustained cooperation across states, communities, and interest groups over decades. The river linking project demands exactly that kind of long-term, coordinated governance, and India's political system isn't structured to provide it. More than 4 decades after it was first formally proposed, India's national river linking project remains mostly on paper. The estimated cost has ballooned from $110 billion to $170 billion and counting. Only one pilot link has been completed, and even that isn't fully operational. Diplomatic obstacles remain unresolved. State-level political opposition hasn't diminished, and the farmers who were supposed to benefit have shown they won't accept the project without their terms being met. So what's the path forward? Some experts argue that India should abandon the mega-project approach entirely and instead focus on decentralized water management. This would mean investing in rainwater harvesting systems at the village level, promoting drip irrigation and other water-efficient farming techniques, cleaning and reviving traditional water bodies like ponds and tanks, and improving wastewater treatment so cities can recycle their water. These solutions are less dramatic, less photogenic, and less likely to inspire national pride. But they're also more achievable, less contentious, and potentially more sustainable in the long run.